November 1975, somewhere in the Angolan bush, 300 kilometers north of the Namibian border. A small armoured car rolls to a halt in the red dust. It is an unremarkable machine. 6 tons, 4 wheels, 3 men inside. Its hull is barely 12 millimeters of welded steel, thin enough that a heavy machine gun at close range would pass clean through it. Its turret is a narrow cone of grey metal with a long gun jutting from the front. It carries no night vision, no stabilizer, no laser rangefinder. It cannot fire accurately while moving. It was designed in France as a colonial police vehicle. It was never intended to fight tanks. Standing on the opposite riverbank 200 meters away sat a Soviet T-34 tank, 32 tons of rolled armor, a cannon that had conquered Berlin, a machine that had won World War II. The T-34's crew were Cuban soldiers, veterans, well-supplied, well-supported. The armoured car facing them was crewed by South African conscripts aged 18 and 19, who had driven from the border on a tourist road map from a Caltex petrol station. The Eland swung its turret. It did not look like a weapon that could kill anything. It looked ridiculous. It looked wrong. Its crew called it the Noddy Car. It fired once. The T-34's turret came off. Its name was the Eland Armoured Car, and over the next 13 years it would destroy T-34s and T-54s, chase Cuban armoured columns through the Angolan lowveld, and become the most combat-proven wheeled armoured vehicle in the Cold War. It was a licensed copy of a French police car. It was built under a mandatory United Nations arms embargo, and it was never supposed to exist at all. To understand why the Eland existed, you need to understand the position South Africa found itself in during the late 1950s. The South African Defence Force was still relying on British Daimler Ferret scout cars from World War II, armed with a single machine gun, starved of spare parts, tactically obsolete. A new strategic study concluded that South Africa's most probable future wars would not be fought in Europe, but across the vast semi-arid terrain of southern Africa, where mobility, range and firepower mattered more than armour thickness. A vehicle was needed, fast, light, long-legged, but with a gun that could genuinely threaten anything it encountered. 3 candidates were evaluated: the British Alvis Saladin, the Panhard EBR, and the Panhard AML. The AML won. In July 1961, South Africa's Defence Minister Jim Fuchs and Commandant General Peter Grobelaar flew to Paris and sat across a table from Panhard's directors. The deal they negotiated was unusually ambitious: 100 complete AML armoured cars purchased outright, plus turrets, components, and a production license for the domestic manufacture of 800 more inside South Africa. The contract was awarded to Sandock Austral, with production lines established in Boksburg and Durban. West German engineers from Henschel provided technical assistance, Panhard having quietly routed the deal through them to insulate itself from criticism by its other African clients. The first locally assembled vehicles, designated Eland Mark II, rolled off the line in July 1963 with 40% local content. The result was immediately rejected. All 56 Mark II vehicles were returned to Sandock Austral for complete disassembly and rebuild. South African tolerances and quality control had not yet matched French standards. The engineers went back to work. They did not stop improving it for the next 23 years. By 1967, 2/3 of the Eland's components were locally sourced. By 1970, 500 Elands were in service, the majority carrying the 60mm mortar turret for fire support, and 131 mounting the 90mm gun that would define the vehicle's legacy. By the time the final Mark VII variant entered production in 1979, South Africa manufactured 95% of the vehicle domestically. This included the complete 90mm gun, the mortar, the fire control optics, and every round of ammunition. The timing was decisive. The United Nations had imposed a voluntary arms embargo in 1963, tightened it in 1970, and made it mandatory under Chapter 7 of the United Nations Charter in November 1977. South Africa had built the factory, secured the license, and trained the engineers before the door slammed shut. The single most consequential modification came with the Mark V variant. The original Panhard air-cooled flat-4 engine overheated catastrophically in African conditions. Crews in Angola reported engine temperatures that made the vehicle undrivable by mid-afternoon. South Africa replaced it entirely with the Chevrolet 153, a water-cooled inline 4-cylinder petrol engine originally designed for the Chevrolet Nova, manufactured locally by General Motors South Africa. It produced 86 to 90 horsepower, at 4,600 revolutions per minute. To accommodate liquid cooling, engineers had to reconstruct the entire rear hull section. They mounted the engine on sliding rails, allowing a complete field replacement in 40 minutes. That figure was not theoretical. It was a combat requirement, written in the heat of Angola. The final vehicle was compact and lean, 6 tons combat ready, 5.12 meters long with the gun forward, 2 meters wide. A crew of 3, commander, gunner, driver. Maximum road speed of 90 to 100 kilometers per hour, giving it a tactical advantage over anything tracked it would ever face. Operational range of 450 kilometers on road, 12 millimeters of armor at best. 29 rounds of 90mm ammunition stowed in the turret bustle. Every one of those rounds carried a shaped charge warhead that could punch 320mm of steel plate at any range. That penetration figure is the key to everything that follows. 320mm of armor killed by a high-explosive anti-tank round whose penetration is independent of velocity. A BRDM 2 armoured car carried 14mm of protection. A BTR-60 armoured personnel carrier carried 11mm. A T-34-85 carried 90mm, at its thickest point on the turret front. On paper, the Eland's gun could kill every one of them with a single round. In practice, it did exactly that, again and again, across a front that stretched from the Angolan coast to the Zambian border. Now, before we get into the combat record, if you are finding this deep dive into Cold War armoured warfare worth your time, please hit subscribe. It takes a second, it costs you nothing, and it helps this channel continue producing this kind of content. The Eland's baptism of fire came in October 1975, when South Africa covertly intervened in Angola's civil war. Operation Savannah deployed roughly 3,000 South African soldiers in unmarked uniforms, carrying no identification, fighting for a country that officially denied they were there. 22 Eland 90s were flown to the interior to spearhead the advance. Their commanders were regular officers. Their crews were 19-year-old national servicemen. Colonel Jan Breitenbach's Task Force Zulu covered 3,159 kilometers in 33 days, fought 21 engagements, and at Kateng on November 2 and 3, knocked out 7 enemy armoured vehicles in the war's first armour versus armour battle. Cuban General Abelardo Colomé Barra later wrote that his inability to counter the Eland's speed and manoeuvrability was among his greatest tactical frustrations of the entire campaign. Then came Ebo. The Battle of Ebo on November 23, 1975 is remembered in the South African Armoured Corps as its darkest day of the entire border war. Battle Group Foxbat, commanded by Captain Johan Holm, attempted to bypass a blown bridge by pushing through the town of Ebo toward Kibala. Cuban and Angolan government forces had prepared an ambush at the Mabasa River crossing with meticulous care. When Lieutenant Johan de Toit's lead Eland reached the bridge, a 75mm recoilless rifle on the high ground above put a round through the turret. Trooper Neil Lombard was killed instantly. Within minutes, 3 more Elands were struck by rocket-propelled grenades fired from foxholes at 60-meter range. A BM-21 Grad rocket salvo from 2,500 meters out obliterated the mortar platoon, killing the mortar commander and more than a dozen Allied soldiers in a single strike. Captain Holm was killed while standing in an Eland turret directing the withdrawal when a 122mm rocket hit within meters of him. 5 Elands were destroyed. 2 were captured intact and later exhibited as war trophies. Lieutenant Dutoit was pinned inside his wrecked vehicle for the rest of the day. He escaped that night on foot, making contact with friendly forces 12 hours later. His fellow crews called him Magnet Arse from that day forward, and he wore the name with considerable pride. The redemption came 19 days later. On December 12, 1975, Battle Group Foxbat returned to the near river crossing with reinforced artillery, fresh Eland crews, and hard-won tactical intelligence. What followed was methodical, controlled, and lethal. 12 Eland 90s crossed the rebuilt bridge under the heaviest artillery barrage of the entire operation. In the fighting that followed, Lieutenant Van Vuren's troop encountered a Soviet-supplied truck full of Cuban soldiers attempting to pass their column using indicator lights, apparently confused about who was who in the dust and chaos. Van Vuren let the truck overtake his Eland, then he put a 90mm round through its rear. All 20 occupants were killed. He subsequently ran out of ammunition, encountered 20 more Cuban soldiers taking cover in a farmhouse, closed his hatches, and shot 11 of them through the turret hatch with his service pistol. Sergeant Danny Roxo was awarded the Honoris Crux for killing 12 enemy soldiers during bridge reconnaissance that same day. South African casualties at Bridge 14 numbered 4 dead. Cuban and Angolan government losses are estimated at 200 to 400 killed. 6 days after Bridge 14, on December 18th, the war's most significant armour engagement occurred. An Eland troop attached to Battle Group Orange, under Captain Fred Rindle of 1st Special Service Battalion, was reconnoitring river crossings east of the main axis when it identified 3 T-34-85 tanks dug into the opposite bank. A single Eland moved forward, levelled its gun, and destroyed the lead T-34 with 1 90mm heat round. The other 2 tanks withdrew. A 6-tonne wheeled car had just killed a 32-tonne Soviet tank that had been the most feared armoured vehicle on Earth 30 years earlier. In the turret, the crew barely had room to reload. Operation Protea in August and September of 1981 was the Eland's finest hour. Roughly 5,000 South African soldiers in 4 battle groups struck Angolan government and South West Africa People's Organisation bases at Zangongo and Ongiva, in the largest South African mechanised operation since World War II. At Zangongo on August 24th, Eland 90 troops encountered a company of T-34-85 tanks used as static artillery pieces, their hulls dug into revetments facing south. The South Africans attacked from the north. 3 T-34s were destroyed by concentrated 90mm fire before their crews could traverse their turrets to respond. One officer later recorded what he saw that morning. A small, odd-looking armoured car with a long gun barreled toward the enemy position at top speed, stopped in the open at 80 metres, waited 2 seconds, and fired 1 shot. The T-34's turret was lying off to one side when the smoke cleared. The vehicle's body was burning, belching black smoke into the morning sky. The officer noted that he had never seen anything killed so cleanly, so quickly, by something that looked so incapable of killing. On the Zangongo to Kahama highway, Elands exploited their road speed to set up blocking positions against a fleeing Angolan government convoy. The lead vehicle was identified as a BRDM-2. 3 rounds set it ablaze. The trailing trucks, armoured personnel carriers, and rocket launchers were destroyed or captured. Operation Protea ultimately netted the South African Defence Force over 3,000 tons of Soviet military hardware, including 8 T-34 tanks, 3 BRDM-2s, approximately 200 trucks, artillery pieces, and communications equipment. Angolan government and People's Organisation losses reached over 800 killed. South African dead numbered 10. Among the bodies found in the overrun headquarters at Zangongo were 4 Soviet military advisors, including Warrant Officer Nikolai Pestretsov. But the Bush War was also teaching the Eland's limits. Operation Askari in December 1983 exposed the vehicle's fundamental inadequacy against the latest Soviet armour. A squadron of Elands manned by reserve soldiers from Regiment Muirivier and Regiment Malopo was assigned to Task Force Victor under Commandant van Grayling. At Kuvalai, the force was counterattacked by Angolan government T-54 and T-55 tanks, supported by 2 Cuban battalions. The T-54 and T-55 carried frontal armour approaching 200mm. The Eland's 320mm penetration was theoretically sufficient. In practice, in the dust and confusion of a night engagement, against a moving target, with a gun that required the vehicle to halt before firing, it was not enough. Multiple hits were required to achieve penetration. With only 29 rounds on board and no stabilised sight, the Eland's gunners ran out of ammunition before they ran out of targets. The withdrawal at Kuvalai became, for a brief period, a retreat. General Ep van Lille's post-operation report was unsparing. The Eland could not stand up to the heavier protection and armament of T-54 and T-55 tanks. The Eland was removed from conventional armoured combat. A squadron of Oliphant tanks was kept on permanent standby for all future operations. The anti-armour role passed to the Ratel 90, which mounted the Eland's proven turret on a faster, larger diesel-powered 6-wheeled hull. On paper, the Soviet BRDM-2 appeared to offer comparable capabilities as a wheeled armoured scout car. In practice, the BRDM-2 was designed to observe and report, not to fight. Its 14mm armour offered modest protection against small arms. Its machine gun armament, typically a heavy 12.7mm, was effective against unprotected infantry. Against another armoured vehicle, it was a liability. The Eland, by contrast, was designed from the beginning to fight and destroy. Its 90mm gun gave it what South African doctrine called first-shot lethality, the ability to kill any target it encountered before that target could respond effectively. This was the core philosophical difference. The Soviets built vehicles to avoid contact. South Africa built vehicles to seek it. The Eland was exported to more than a dozen African nations, including Morocco, Chad, Zimbabwe, Senegal, and Uganda. Morocco received the largest foreign consignment and deployed Elands extensively in the Western Sahara War against the Polisario Front. In September 1979, Moroccan Elands were sent through a narrow valley against the explicit advice of South African instructors who had personally walked the ground. The Polisario ambushed the column and captured over 30 intact vehicles, several still bearing Afrikaans inscriptions on their fuel caps. After 1979, Panhard itself began sourcing spare parts for the original AML from South Africa. The company that had created the design was buying components from the country that had copied it. The Eland entered its final years of frontline service through the mid-1980s. Its last confirmed major action came on October 5, 1987, when Eland 90S ambushed and destroyed an Angolan government motorised column of BTR 60S and trucks north of Ongiva. On June 27, 1988, a Cuban MiG-23 airstrike destroyed one of the last combat-deployed Elands outside the Kalake Dam in a strike that killed 11 South African soldiers. Among the final casualties of a war that had lasted 13 years, the Eland was officially retired from South African National Defence Force service in 1994, replaced by the Rooikat, a 28-tonne, 8-wheeled armoured car with a stabilised 76mm high-velocity gun, laser rangefinder, and the ability to fire accurately at 120 km per hour. The Rooikat was superior in every measurable respect. It could also not fit in a Hercules transport aircraft. The Eland weighed 6 tons and could be flown anywhere in Africa within hours. The SADF discovered, shortly after retiring it, that some tactical problems can only be solved by a vehicle that is small enough to disappear into the bush and fast enough to outrun everything it cannot outfight. Several Elands survive today. The South African Armour Museum at Tempe in Bloemfontein holds multiple examples, including an Eland 90 Mark VII returned to running condition as recently as October 2024. The Ditsong National Museum of Military History in Johannesburg displays a further example. 2 vehicles captured at the Battle of Ibo in 1975 reportedly still stand in Angola as battlefield memorials. In a factory in Boksburg in July 1963, the first locally assembled Eland was rejected and sent back for rebuilding. It looked wrong. It was too light. Its steel was too thin. Its engine unreliable. Its components insufficiently precise. Every criticism was correct. It was not fast enough for the tracked vehicles that chased it. It had no protection against mines, no night vision, no gun stabilizer, no ability to fight on the move. Its armour could be penetrated by a heavy machine gun at close range. It carried fewer than 30 rounds and had to stop completely to aim. And yet in the Angolan lowveld, in the red dust of Zangongo, at 80 metres from a T-34 that should have killed it, a 6-tonne copy of a French police car fired once and ended the argument. That is not an accident of history. That is what happens when a small country, cut off from every weapon supplier on Earth, is forced to build exactly the weapon it needs and nothing more. The Noddy Car. It was never supposed to work. It worked every time it mattered.